People ask me what the terminus looked like from the outside. They always expect me to say it was wrong somehow. Foreboding. That some animal instinct fired the moment I stepped off the transit shuttle and saw it sitting there at the edge of the settlement perimeter. They want the story to begin with a sign I ignored, because that makes it a story about a woman who had fair warning and walked in anyway, and that story lets everyone sleep easier. It puts the weight of it on me. But the truth is, from the outside, the terminus looked like what they told us it was. A hotel. A boutique transit facility for travelers moving through Outpost Verano on their way to the inner settlements or the deep-range platforms. The structure was low and clean, built from the same pale composite as everything else on the frontier, designed to blend, designed to look like nothing special had happened there, and nothing special ever would. There was a sign in 3 languages above the main entrance. There was a flagstone path from the transit pad to the front doors. There was a small garden of drought-tolerant plants, arranged with the deliberate tastelessness of places that know their guests are only passing through. I walked in because Demian asked me to. That is the whole of it. That is the seed of the whole thing. Not some dark compulsion, not a lapse in judgment I can point to and explain. I walked in because the man I had been with for 4 years stood on that flagstone path in the red-brown dusk of an outpost evening and told me this could fix us, and I loved him enough to try. My name is Francisca. I was 31 years old that evening. I was a calibration technician for the secondary relay arrays, which means I spent my working life making sure distant machines were talking to each other correctly, that signals were not being lost in the gap between what was sent and what was received. I was good at it. I had been good at it for 7 years. And I had been bad at being Demian's partner for about 2 of those 7, in the slow, grinding way that 2 people who once fit together stop fitting, and neither of them can name the exact moment it happened. The collective's integration service had been legal on the frontier outposts for 11 months by then. The Accord gave them the right. That is what everyone forgets when they talk about the terminus years now, when they talk about the integration facilities as if they were obviously wrong from the start. The Accord gave them the right. Humanity's negotiating team, and I will never stop being furious about this, signed the integration clauses into the framework because someone in a room far away from any outpost decided the collective's technology was too valuable to refuse. Body bonding. Shared sensation. The dissolution of certain barriers between 2 nervous systems, temporary and fully reversible, or so the documentation stated. The collective presented it as a gift, an intimacy technology, a way for humans who had grown distant from each other to close the gap at the neurological level, to share experience in a way language never could. The brochure, and there was a brochure, I saw it. Demian had pulled it up on his reader 3 weeks before and left it open on the kitchen table where I would find it, described the process as a bridge. Between people. Between what you feel and what you cannot say. Demian needed a bridge. I understood that. I was not heartless. I could see what had happened to him in the 2 years since his brother died on Platform 7, the way grief had built a wall around him that he could see out of but could not climb down from, the way he had stopped being able to tell me things he used to tell me without thinking. I watched him walk through our shared rooms like a man carrying something too heavy to put down. I watched him try to be present and fail. I watched him search for a way to hand me the weight of it so I could carry some of it with him, and find no door. He found the Terminus brochure 6 months after our worst fight, the fight where I said things I still carry, where he said nothing at all, which was worse. That particular kind of silence, the silence of someone who has decided that speaking will not help, who has decided to absorb rather than answer, is something I have thought about a great deal since the Terminus. The collective found their customers by walking through human settlements and looking for people who had learned to absorb, who had stopped finding language for the things that hurt, who needed a bridge because every bridge they had built themselves had come apart. Demian had stopped finding language for his grief after Platform 7, and I had stopped being able to reach him across that, and had eventually stopped trying in the way I used to try, the direct and sometimes clumsy way, and had started trying in quieter ways that he often did not notice. Two people working very hard in parallel and never quite intersecting. A grief counselor would have helped. Probably. We had talked about it and never scheduled the first appointment, for the reasons that people who need grief counselors never schedule their first appointment. The inertia of people who are functioning, who are getting through their days, who can always put it off one more week because nothing is catastrophically wrong yet. Nothing has broken completely. There is always one more week. The Terminus brochure had arrived into this gap, like something that knew exactly what it was looking for. So when he stood on the flagstone path and said this could fix us, I said yes. I said yes because I loved him. I also said yes because I was afraid that if I said no, there would be no us left to fix. I want to be clear about that. I want to be honest about the exact mixture of things that walked me through those front doors, because the story gets told wrong sometimes. It gets told as though I was dragged. I was not dragged. I walked. My fear and my love and my exhaustion walked me right through those front doors and into a lobby that smelled of something I could not name, something clean and faintly sweet, the way the air in a medical bay smells before they pipe in the antiseptic, when it is just the recycled air and the equipment hum. The lobby was the first place I felt it. Not fear, not yet, something quieter than fear, a kind of watchfulness, the way the air feels before weather comes, when the light changes and the animals go still. I noticed the other guests, 4 of them in the lobby seating area, 2 couples. They sat very quietly. They were not talking to each other. They were not reading or looking at their devices. They were simply sitting with the particular stillness of people who are waiting, but without the fidgeting or the impatience that waiting normally produces. Their hands were in their laps. Their faces were composed. One woman had her eyes slightly closed, and the expression on her face was something between peace and absence. I noticed all of this in the span of about 6 seconds. Then La Anfitriona came out. She introduced herself by role, not by name. She said, "I am the host. Welcome to the Terminus." She said it in the pleasant, unhurried way of someone who has said the same words many hundreds of times and has never once found them inadequate. She was wearing a pale uniform, buttoned high, and her hair was back, and her face was the kind of face that is difficult to describe afterward because there was nothing specifically wrong with it, and yet it left no impression. Her eyes were dark. Her smile arrived at exactly the right moment and stayed exactly as long as a smile should stay, and then it went. Everything about her was calibrated. I have spent a lot of time thinking about the host since then. She was not human. I believe that now without qualification, though I cannot prove it in any way a court would accept. The collective operated their frontier facilities with human-presenting staff always. The Accord protocols required a human interface. What I believe, what I know in the part of me that spent 7 years calibrating signals and could always feel when a transmission was not quite right, is that the woman who greeted us in that lobby was wearing something that was almost a person, the way a drawing of a door is almost a door. But I did not know that then. Then she was just a very composed woman in a pale uniform, and she was taking us through the intake procedure with the gentle efficiency of someone who has never once wasted a word. She explained the integration service. She explained it beautifully. I will give her that. She used the word bridge, which was the word from the brochure, and she talked about the process as a temporary permeability, a controlled opening of certain neurological channels that allows paired individuals to share sensory and emotional data in real time. She said the duration was adjustable. She said the process was reversible. She said the collective had performed the integration on more than 40,000 human pairs in frontier facilities and had a safety record she could provide documentation for. She said many things, and she said all of them in a voice like water running over stone, perfectly even, perfectly paced. I listened. I watched Demian listen. Demian sat forward in his chair with his hands clasped and his elbows on his knees, the way he used to sit when something interested him, when he was young and before Platform 7, and before grief put the wall up. He looked more alive than he had looked in 2 years. He looked like a man who had just been told there was a door. And that is the moment I should examine most carefully, because that is where my instinct first spoke and I did not listen. The instinct said, he needs this more than he needs to decide whether it is safe. The instinct said, you are the obstacle here. And there was a version of me, the version that was tired, the version that had been carrying the weight of our distance for 2 years, that wanted to stop being the obstacle, that wanted to sit back and let Demian have his door and walk through it with him and come out the other side repaired. That version of me was almost enough. The host was explaining the first stage of the process. Preliminary alignment, she called it. A brief period in a preparation room where both individuals would be monitored while the collective system mapped the baseline architecture of their nervous systems. She said it took approximately 20 minutes. She said it was entirely non-invasive. She said they could stop at any point. She said they could stop at any point. I remember that. I remember nodding it, the way I note a reading that falls just inside the acceptable range and makes the console light stay green when something in me says the number is wrong. Demian looked at me. He did not ask. He had learned not to ask, because asking gave me room to say no, and saying no was the thing that ended conversations, the thing that put the wall between us. Instead, he looked at me with everything he had, with 2 years of grief and silence and the specific loneliness of a man standing next to the person he loves and being unable to reach them. He put all of that in his eyes and he looked at me. And I said, all right. I said, let's hear the rest of it. The host smiled, right on schedule. She took us down a corridor. The corridor was carpeted and lit with the same clean indirect light as the lobby, and there were doors on either side at regular intervals, and each door was closed, and I noticed that I could not hear anything behind any of them. Not the way a well-insulated room is quiet. The way a room is quiet when there is nothing in it to make sound. I told myself that was good insulation. I told myself a lot of things in that corridor. The preparation room was small and white. 2 chairs, more like recliners, padded, adjustable, positioned facing each other with about a meter of space between them. Equipment on a low cart to one side, monitoring leads, a console with a small display, what looked like a pair of lightweight haptic collars of the sort used in sensory rehabilitation. A second attendant was already in the room. He was a man, or presented as one, and he had the same quality the host had, the same exactness, the same calibrated warmth, the same eyes that were dark and gave you the impression of depth without quite providing it. He introduced himself as the technician. The host explained that the technician would fit the monitoring leads and walk us through the alignment phase. She said she would be just outside. She said we had all the time we needed. Then she left. I sat in one of the reclined chairs. Demian sat in the other. The technician moved around the cart with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done this particular set of movements so many times they no longer need to think about the order. He handed me a consent disclosure on a reader. It was 11 pages. He said I could take as long as I needed to read it. I read it. All 11 pages. Demian shifted in his chair twice while I read it. I felt him wanting to say something and not saying it, and I was grateful for that restraint even as I was aware of what it cost him. The consent disclosure described the integration process in medical language that was precise, and I would later understand, carefully incomplete. It described the haptic interface collar as a signal transducer. It described the alignment process as bidirectional baseline mapping. It used the phrase temporary permeability 11 times. It said the process was reversible. It said discontinuation was available at any point during the alignment phase. It said during the alignment phase, not after, during. I noticed that. I noted it the way I note anomalous readings. I filed it. I signed. Demian signed before I finished reading my own copy. I heard the confirmation tone from his reader while I was still on page 7. The technician fitted the monitoring leads with the quiet competence of someone who is very good at being unobtrusive. Small adhesive contacts at the temples, at the base of the skull, at the inside of the wrists. The haptic collar went on last, light, almost weightless, sitting at the base of the throat in a way that was not uncomfortable but was impossible to ignore. The way any new pressure on the body demands a period of attention before you can set it aside. I did not set it aside. The collar had a seam, a join line running along the left side. The join was almost invisible, almost perfectly flush, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding material. Almost. My hands do fine work. 7 years of calibration teaches your hands to notice tolerances. I noticed the seam was not flush. I noticed it in the way you notice a signal that is 97% clean, clean enough to pass automated filters, not clean enough to satisfy someone who has made a career out of the 3%. The technician told us to relax and breathe normally. He turned to the console. The display came on. And that is when I understood that something was wrong. Not from any single thing, not from any alarm or signal or dramatic revelation, from the aggregate, from the weight of the small things I had been filing. The other guests in the lobby, sitting too still, the host's smile arriving and departing on exact schedule, the consent disclosure's careful language around discontinuation, the door that did not sound like a door with a room behind it, the collar's almost flush seam. Taken separately, each one was nothing, a quirk, a detail, the kind of thing a tired woman on a difficult evening talks herself out of. Taken together, they were a transmission that was 97% clean. I said I need to stop. I said it quietly, the way I say things when I am certain, not loud, not panicked. I said it to the technician's back while his hands were moving over the console. He turned around. His face was pleasant and attentive. He said, "Of course. Is there something you'd like to discuss?" I said, "I'd like the collar removed, please." A pause, very small, the length of a dropped frame in a transmission, the kind of gap that the signal buries and most systems never flag. He said, "The alignment phase hasn't begun yet. We can answer any questions you have before." I said, "I'd like the collar removed now, please." Another pause, and in that pause I felt Demian looking at me. I knew what was in his eyes without turning to look. I knew the specific quality of his disappointment, the way it was always mixed with something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a man watching a door close. I knew what this looked like from his side of the room. His partner finding a reason, his partner pulling away, his partner deciding against him again. I also knew what I had felt in the 3 seconds between saying I need to stop and the technician's first response. Something in the collar had changed. Not the pressure was the same. Something more subtle, a warmth, barely perceptible, the kind of warmth that is not temperature but current. The alignment phase hasn't begun yet. Except something had begun. Something had begun the moment I sat in the chair. I said, "Take the collar off or I'll take it off myself." The technician's pleasant expression did not change. That was the most frightening thing, not that it changed into something else, but that it simply held, like a rendered image that has stopped receiving updates. He said, "I'll need to consult with the host before removing the equipment outside of standard procedure." I reached up and took the collar off myself. The join line was not just a seam. When my fingers found it and pulled, I felt the resistance of something that was not meant to separate. A small resistance, a suggestion, the kind of resistance a thing offers when it has already begun to adhere. It came off. It came off because I got to it in time. I was very careful not to think about what would have happened if I had waited another 3 minutes. I stood up. I said, "Demian, And the whole of our 4 years was in that single word, the whole negotiation. Everything I was not saying, which was, I cannot explain this to you right now in a way that will satisfy you. I cannot give you a reason that does not sound like fear and reluctance dressed up as danger. I am asking you to trust me the way I have trusted you, which is imperfectly and with difficulty in all ways. He sat in his chair for a long moment. He was looking at me, he was deciding. And then he stood up. He did not say anything. He pulled the monitoring leads off his temples and his wrists, two of them tearing slightly because the adhesive had set faster than normal adhesive sets, and he did not say anything about that either. He stood up, and he was next to me, and we were facing the technician together. The technician had not moved. His pleasant expression had not changed. He said, "If you'd like to reschedule, the host can." I said, "We're leaving." And we left. We walked back down the corridor. I counted the doors the way I count signal intervals when I am maintaining focus on a task that my body wants to panic about. 14 doors, all closed, all quiet. The host was in the lobby. She was standing near the front entrance, which I noted because she had said she would be just outside the preparation room, which was not the lobby. She was positioned between us and the front doors in the way that something positions itself between you and the exit when it does not expect you to use the exit. She said, "Is everything all right? Was there a problem with the room?" I said, "No problem, we're leaving." Her expression was the same as it had been when we arrived. I could see her deciding, I understand this now, deciding what register to use. She had available to her a range of human-seeming responses, the way a well-stocked kit has a range of tools, and she was selecting the right one. She selected concern. She said, "I hope nothing made you uncomfortable. The integration process can feel unfamiliar at first. It's completely natural to want to take a moment to." I said, "Move, please." And something happened in her face then that I have never been able to fully describe. The concern was there, and then for a fraction of a second something else was there, not anger, not surprise, but a quality I can only call calculation. The way a system recalibrates when it receives data outside its expected parameters. She was recalibrating. We were outside her expected parameters. She was not accustomed to people who said move. She was accustomed to people who wanted the bridge. People who were tired and grieving and desperate to close a gap. People who had already signed the consent disclosure. People who had walked in through the front door wanting to be convinced. She was not accustomed to the specific flavor of stubborn that comes from a woman who spent 7 years making sure signals arrived intact and had learned to trust the 3%. She moved. Not immediately. A half-second that was 1/2 second too long, that confirmed everything the alignment phase and the seam on the collar and the 2 still lobby guests had been telling me. Then she moved, and we walked through the front doors, and the evening air of the outpost came in around us, dry and faintly metallic, the way frontier air always is, and I had never in my life been so grateful for the smell of metal. We walked to the transit pad. The pad was 200 meters from the terminus entrance. I counted every step. Not from anxiety, I was past anxiety, into the territory on the far side of it that is very flat and very clear, the place where the body is still running its emergency protocols, but the mind has stepped back from them and is simply observing. I counted because counting was something to do with the part of me that wanted to run. Demian walked beside me and did not touch me and did not ask me anything. He understood, in the way that 4 years gives you the understanding of a person's body language at a molecular level, that I needed the space around me to be uncomplicated for a minute. He gave me that. When we reached the pad, I stopped and turned around. The terminus sat at the edge of the settlement perimeter exactly as it had when we arrived, low and clean and pale. The sign in 3 languages, the drought-tolerant garden, a building designed to look like nothing special had happened there and nothing special ever would. In one of its rooms, Someone was sitting in a chair with monitoring leads at their temples and a collar at their throat, and the alignment phase was completing, and they had signed the consent disclosure, and they had wanted the bridge and they were getting it. And from where I stood, there was nothing I could do about that tonight. I turned back to the transit pad. Demian did not speak for the first 4 minutes. I did not try to fill the silence. I was tracking him the same way I tracked signals on a long diagnostic, not measuring for peaks, measuring for drift, waiting to see what the sustained output looked like. When he finally spoke, he said, "You felt something." Not a question. I said, "Yes." He said, "In the collar." I said, "Before the collar, from the moment we sat down." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I didn't feel anything." I said, "I know." He said, "I wanted to." And that was the whole of it. That was the weight he had been carrying for 2 years, arriving finally in 4 words on a transit pad in the dark. Not said in the preparation room of the terminus with the right conditions and the right equipment and the right calibrated process. Said here, imperfectly, in the open air, to a woman who had just embarrassed him in front of strangers and who could not give him a clinical reason why. I said, "I know you did." I said, "I'm sorry I couldn't give you that." He said, "Don't be sorry, you got us out." We took the shuttle back to the settlement. I filed an incident report that night with the Outpost Safety Authority, which was a 4-person office with 2 active cases and a console that was 2 software versions behind. I described the collar resistance. I described the pauses in the technician's response time. I described the position of the host at the lobby exit. I described the lobby guests and their stillness. The OSA officer who took the report was a careful, tired man named Vasquez who wrote everything down and did not dismiss any of it, which I appreciated. He said the integration facilities were operating under Accord framework, which meant the OSA's jurisdiction was limited, which meant he would forward the report to the Regional Safety Board, which meant it would sit in a queue. I said, "How long?" He said, 6 to 8 weeks for standard review. I said, "What do I do in the meantime?" He said, "Don't go back in." I said, "I won't." I went home. I sat at my kitchen table. I read the integration consent disclosure again, all 11 pages, and this time I read it with fresh eyes, the eyes of someone who already knew the answer and was looking for the question. And there it was, in the language that had seemed merely technical the first time. Temporary permeability of the integumentary interface, bidirectional baseline mapping of cortical architecture. Integumentary, of or relating to the skin. The skin is not a limit, the brochure had said. The skin is not a limit. I had thought that was marketing language. I had thought it was a metaphor for intimacy, for closeness, for the dissolution of emotional barriers between 2 people. It was not a metaphor. In the weeks that followed, I talked to people. I am not an investigator. I am a calibration technician. But calibration is, at its core, the practice of comparing what a system says it is doing to what it is actually doing. And I had 7 years of practice and a fundamental inability to leave a discrepancy alone. I talked to the transit workers who serviced the pad nearest the terminus. I talked to the settlement's medical staff, who had seen a small number of guests check in to the terminus and had never seen any of them check out. The facility maintained that guests who completed the full integration process typically moved on to a connecting settlement or a deep-range platform directly from the facility, which explained why they were not seen departing via the main transit pad. The medical staff thought this explanation was completely plausible, because it was logistically plausible, because the Accord framework allowed for direct transit connections. Because they had no reason to look for the discrepancy that I had been handed by feeling a current in a collar that had not yet been activated. I talked to the 2 couples I had seen in the lobby. This took 3 weeks. Their names were in the facility's public intake log. Accord transparency requirements mandated a public intake log, and 2 of them lived in the Verano settlement. I knocked on doors. The first couple was not in. The second couple answered. They were a man and a woman in their late 40s, and they had the same quality I had noticed in the lobby: the stillness, the composure, the expression that was pleasant and correctly human but not quite inhabited. They said the integration had been wonderful. They said they would recommend it without reservation. They said they felt closer than they had in years. I asked them what it felt like. The woman thought about this for a moment. She said, like being very comfortable, like being where you're supposed to be. I asked if they had any discomfort during the process. The man said, none at all, very gentle. I asked if they had felt any warmth in the collar before the alignment phase began. They both looked at me, at exactly the same moment, with exactly the same angle of the head, the way 2 antennae orient toward the same signal. I said thank you for your time, and I left. I sent my notes to a researcher named Ortega at the University of the Inner Settlements, who had published the only independent paper on collective integration technology in the prior year. The paper was narrowly scoped and carefully neutral in its conclusions, and had clearly been written by someone who was trying very hard not to say what the data was suggesting. Ortega replied to my transmission in 40 minutes, which told me he had been waiting for someone to send him what I had sent him. We talked for 3 hours. He was careful at first, the careful of someone who has learned to be careful, who has had a paper receive a polite but firm response from the Accord's Scientific Liaison Office 3 weeks after publication, who has learned that the distance between what the data suggests and what you are permitted to say is its own kind of gap. He asked me questions. I answered them. When I described the collar's resistance, he went quiet for a full 10 seconds. When I described the 2 lobby guests orienting toward me at exactly the same angle at exactly the same moment, he said, "That's the 3rd independent account I've received." I said 3rd. He said, 2 others in 8 months. A maintenance worker at the Callum platform facility who noticed the lobby guests and described the same quality. A medical transport officer at outpost leave who turned back from the intake process for reasons she described as a bad feeling and spent 3 months trying to get anyone to take that seriously. I said, what happened to their reports? He said, forwarded to the Regional Safety Board, standard queue. I said 6 to 8 weeks. He said, for the Callum report it's been 22 weeks, no action taken. I sat with that for a moment. 22 weeks, and the facility at Callum still running, and the 46 others running, and the count climbing toward whatever number it eventually reached. What Ortega had pieced together from public data, intake logs, medical records, transit manifests, the Accord's own integration technology documentation, was a picture with gaps in it. Gaps that were consistent, gaps that formed a shape. The integration process, as implemented by the collective in frontier facilities, was not bidirectional. Or rather, it was bidirectional but not symmetrical. What the human nervous system contributed to the exchange, the full architecture of a person's sensory experience, emotional memory, identity structure, was substantially larger than what it received. The human partner in an integration was not sharing a bridge. The human partner was providing substrate. Temporary permeability. The skin is not a limit. The collective did not experience the world in individual bodies. They never had. What humans experienced as separate selves, the collective experienced as components, nodes in a distributed network, each carrying a portion of the total. The integration service was, from their side of the process, not a therapy for disconnected couples. It was acquisition. Each successful integration added a mapped and accessible human nervous system to the collective's distributed architecture. Not a slave. Not a prisoner. Not even by most readings aware of its new function. Just open, permeable, available. Like a channel that has been unlocked. The collar resistance I had felt was the first stage of the lock procedure. The warmth was the handshake protocol. If I had stayed another 3 minutes, the alignment phase would have completed, and the consent disclosure would have covered it, because the consent disclosure said temporary permeability, and that was exactly what it was. Temporary in the collective's frame of reference, which was not the same as mine. I said to Ortega, "What do we do with this?" He said, "I've been trying to figure that out for 8 months." I said, "How many integration facilities are operating under the accord?" He said 47, on 17 outposts and 4 transit platforms. I said, "How many people have been processed?" He said, "The collective's own reported figure is 40,000. My estimate, based on transit manifest discrepancies, is closer to 60. I said, "What do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have a primary account. I have data. Vasquez at the OSA has an active incident report. Together, that is enough to trigger a mandatory regional safety board review under Accord Article 14. I said, "Article 14 requires evidence of harm to an integrant." He said, "Yes." I said, "The 2 people I spoke to did not seem harmed." He said, "No, that's the problem." We were quiet together for a moment. 2 people on opposite ends of a transmission line, sitting with the weight of a thing that was true, but not yet provable in the way that Article 14 required. I said they were home. They answered the door. They talked to me. He said, "Yes." I said, "But they looked at me the same way at the same time." He said, "Yes." I said, "That's not 2 people. That's 2 terminals running the same session." He said, "That's what I believe." I said, "How do we prove it in a way the board will act on?" And here is the place where I have to be honest about what I did next, because the story gets complicated here. Because what I did next was not wise and not safe, and not the thing a careful person who had just barely gotten out of a processing facility would do if she were thinking clearly. I went back in. Not alone. Ortega arranged for a safety technician from the regional board named Castillo, who had read the full file and had authorization to conduct an informal site inspection under Article 9, a weaker provision than 14, but one that did not require proven harm, only reasonable grounds for concern. Castillo was a compact, quiet woman who carried a scanner that she wore on her wrist like a watch, calibrated to detect active signal traffic in frequencies the collective's integration equipment used. She had the quality that all good investigators I have ever met share. She did not try to be invisible. She just did not call attention to herself. There is a difference. In the transit shuttle on the way to the terminus, she asked me one question. She said, "When you left the first time, did the host attempt to physically prevent you?" I said no. She said, "Did she move to block your exit path?" I said she was standing between us and the doors. When I told her to move, she moved. Castillo said, "How long between the request and the movement?" I said half a second, maybe a little more. She wrote this in her notebook, an actual physical notebook, which I noticed and appreciated. Digital logs can be edited. Paper is harder to revise. She wrote, "Half-second delay complied on verbal request, did not pursue or detain." Then she said, "That's useful." I said, "How?" She said, "A collective-controlled system running an autonomic response protocol would have had either 0 delay or a much longer one. Half a second is a decision interval. She was deciding whether the cost of blocking you was acceptable, not running a reflex. It tells me the facility operators have genuine decision authority, which means they can be held accountable. It's harder to sanction a reflex than it is to sanction a choice." I thought about this for the rest of the transit ride. Ortega also called Demian. I did not ask him to do this. I found out afterward. Demian showed up at the transit pad 20 minutes before our scheduled arrival at the terminus, wearing the expression of a man who has been awake most of the night and has decided something. He said to me, "You're not going back in there without someone who knows where you are and what you're doing." I said, "You know what might be in there?" He said, I know what was in there when you got me out. I didn't have better sense than to walk involuntarily. The least I can do is stand outside and make sure you walk back out. I did not have a good counter-argument. I went in with Castillo. Demian and Ortega waited at the transit pad with an open comm line to the regional board's duty officer. The terminus lobby at midday was as clean and pleasant as it had been at dusk. The flagstone path, the drought-tolerant garden, the sign in 3 languages. The host came out of the corridor the moment we entered, which meant she had been alerted by sensors in the entrance approach, which was standard for hospitality facilities and also for facilities that monitored their perimeter carefully. She said, "Welcome back." She said it to me, not to Castillo, to me, and in those 2 words was a quantity of information that I had not expected. Welcome back meant she remembered me. Welcome back meant my departure had been noted and categorized. Welcome back meant that from her side of the previous encounter, I was not a guest who had changed her mind and left. I was a file that had remained open. I said, "My colleague is here for a routine Article 9 inspection." The host looked at Castillo. Her expression was the same as it always was, pleasant, composed, correctly attentive. She said, "Of course. We're always happy to cooperate with regional board procedures." She said it in a way that was perfectly true and also perfectly aware that Article 9 inspections had no authority to compel access to guest integration records and no jurisdiction over Accord framework procedures. Castillo raised her wrist. The scanner was running. It was set to passive detection. It emitted nothing, read only what was already in the environment. And in the lobby of the terminus, what was already in the environment was a great deal. Castillo looked at the reading. Her face did not change. She was good at that. But her eyes came to mine for just a moment, and what they said was, "You were right." The active signal traffic in the lobby was not consistent with standard hospitality or monitoring equipment. It was consistent with what the collective's integration documentation described as ambient synchronization, a low-level broadcast that the collective system maintained in environments where integrants were present, a carrier signal that kept open channels open. The 2 lobby guests sitting in their chairs were not resting. They were transmitting. Or rather, something was transmitting through them. Castillo said to the host, in a voice as pleasant as the host's own, "I'd like to take some readings in the preparation area, if that's not a problem." The host said, "I'd be happy to arrange a tour of our facilities. Of course, access to areas where guests are currently receiving services would require advanced scheduling to protect their privacy." Castillo said, "Of course." And then she said, "Can you tell me the current count of guests in active integration sessions?" The host said, "I'm afraid specific guest information is confidential under Accord privacy framework." Castillo said, "I'm not asking for their identities. I'm asking for a count." The host said, "That falls within guest privacy protections as well." Castillo pressed something on the scanner and the wrist display updated. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "My scanner is reading 41 active signal sources in this facility. I count 4 visible individuals in this lobby, including you and the 2 seated guests. That leaves 37 signal sources in areas I haven't entered. Can you tell me if that's consistent with your current occupancy?" The calculation in the host's face was more visible now. Not much, she was very good, but more. She was assessing this moment. She was measuring what Castillo had, what it meant, what it could be used for. I want to say she panicked. She did not panic. The collective does not panic. What she did was much colder than panic, she optimized. In the space of about 2 seconds, she calculated the most efficient outcome for the facility and began moving toward it. She said, "I think this might be a good time to involve our legal liaison and schedule a formal Article 9 session, so we can give your inspection the attention it deserves." Which meant this conversation is over. Which meant the readings on Castillo's scanner would be challenged, contextualized, explained away in language that was accurate and incomplete and covered by the Accord framework, which meant that 37 people in rooms along a carpeted corridor would receive whatever they were receiving until the legal process concluded, which would be 6 to 8 weeks. I said 41. The host turned to me. I said, "Your count is 41, for here, 37 in the rooms, but you said you'd performed the integration on 40,000 human pairs and had a safety record you could provide documentation for. 40,000 pairs is 80,000 individuals, 40,000 documented integrations, and yet you have 37 people currently active in a 15-room facility on a frontier outpost. Do you run sessions in parallel? Do you run more than 2 per room?" She said, "I'm not sure I understand the question." I said, "Or is the count different because they're not pairs anymore? Because once both individuals in a pair have been integrated, you don't need the room anymore. You just need the signal. And the signal travels. The signal has been traveling since the Accord gave you 47 facilities and 60,000 open channels." The host was very still. I said, "The skin is not a limit. That's the truth, isn't it? Not for you, not for the collective. The skin stopped being a limit the moment the first integration completed and you had a human nervous system in your network. After that, proximity doesn't matter. The facility doesn't matter. The caller doesn't matter. You could reach any integrated host from anywhere in the network's range." She said, "You're describing a technology you fundamentally misunderstand." I said, "Tell me what I'm getting wrong." She did not. I said, "You're 37 people deep in a building on the edge of a settlement and you've been running since the Accord was signed and you have 46 other facilities doing the same thing. And everyone who walked in here wanted to. Everyone signed the consent. You gave them what they asked for: closeness, connection, the end of the distance. You gave them exactly what the brochure promised. You just didn't mention that you were on the other side of the bridge." The host said, "We should involve the legal liaison." Castillo said, "That's fine. While we wait, I'll be transmitting my preliminary scan results to the regional board's duty officer. Under Article 9, I'm required to do that within 1 hour of observation. The transmission is already drafted." She sent it while she was speaking. I heard the confirmation tone from her wrist unit. The host stood in her lobby and looked at us with her dark, exact eyes, and I watched her recalibrate again, and this time the recalibration was deeper. She was not calculating a single transaction. She was calculating the network. 47 facilities, 60,000 open channels, the Accord framework and its legal timelines, and the 6 to 8 weeks that had always been enough to close the gap between observation and consequence. And then behind her, the 2 lobby guests stood up. Not because anyone spoke to them or gestured to them. They simply stood at the same time with the same movement, and they were looking at us with the same composite attention, and I understood then that they were not standing because they decided to stand. The thing that was running through them had decided. Castillo put her hand on my arm. We walked backward to the entrance. Not fast. The way you back away from something large that has not charged yet but is reading you carefully. I watched the host and the 2 guests and the corridor entrance behind them, and I kept walking, and my hand found the door push bar and pushed, and the dry metallic air of the outpost came in around us and we were outside. Demian was at the end of the flagstone path. He had heard the last part on the open comm line. He looked at my face, and then at Castillo's wrist scanner, and then back at my face, and he did not ask anything, because the answer was in everything he could see. I said, "The board has the scan data." He said, "Good." I said, "It'll take weeks." He said, "I know." I said, 37 people are in there." He said, "I know." We stood on the flagstone path in the afternoon light of the outpost, and we stood with that weight for a moment. The weight of a thing you cannot fix in the next hour or the next day. A thing that is moving through legal channels at the pace that legal channels move. A thing that has 46 other versions of itself operating on 17 other outposts and 4 transit platforms, and will continue operating until the process completes. There was a sound from behind the terminus's front doors. Not loud, not alarming, the kind of sound a building makes when something inside it changes state. And then the facility's external communications antenna went active, visible from where we stood, a retraction extender unit on the roof. And I knew that whatever the host was saying to wherever she was saying it, the network had been informed that the terminus at Outpost Verano had encountered something it had not modeled. A woman who noticed a seam. A woman who said no. Not because she had proof. Not because she had an Article 14 claim or a scanner with court-admissible readings or a researcher's paper, and a safety officer's report already queued for board review. Because something had felt wrong and she had named it, and she had kept nomming it, and she had found the people who would believe her, and she had gone back in. The Accord's emergency review provisions kicked in 41 hours later. Article 14 of the Accord required documented harm. But Article 22, the one that almost no one on the human negotiating team had bothered to read carefully, because it was in a subsection titled Network Propagation Risk, and had been placed there by a collective legal team that expected it never to be invoked. Article 22 required the collective to immediately suspend integration operations across all facilities if the regional board certified credible evidence of non-consensual network access. Castillo scanned data, my primary account, Ortega's manifest analysis, and the 37 active signal sources in a 15-room facility at maximum licensed capacity of 12. Together they were enough. Barely. The board's duty officer understood what she was looking at, and she certified it, and Article 22 dropped on 47 facilities in the same hour. The Accord talks that followed lasted 11 months. I was not in the talks. I gave my statement to 4 different panels in those 11 months and spent the rest of the time at my console, calibrating relay arrays, making sure distant machines were talking to each other correctly, making sure signals were not being lost in the gap between what was sent and what was received. The integrated individuals, 62,000 of them at final count across all facilities, were not killed. That is the thing I have to hold on to. They were not dead. They were open channels in a network. They were permeable in ways they had not consented to, but they were present, they were functional. They were in most observable respects the people they had been before they walked into a terminus facility. The clinical teams who performed the post-accord assessments described something more specific than that. They described individuals who were oriented and responsive, and able to state their names and their occupations and their personal histories, who could answer questions and express preferences and demonstrate continuity of memory, who could, in short, perform personhood by every measurable standard, but who, when asked about their experience of themselves, used a particular cluster of language. Language about being settled, about being in the right place, about being, as the lobby woman had said, where they were supposed to be. One of the assessment clinicians, a woman named Harbor, whose report Ortega forwarded to me, noted that a significant percentage of assessed integrants demonstrated what she called affective flattening, a reduction in the range and intensity of felt emotion that was not precisely what would be called depression in a clinical sense, but rather the opposite. Not too dark, not numb, but too even, too smooth, too comfortable for people who had, in most cases, walked through a period of significant relational distress to get to the facility in the first place. She wrote, "It is difficult to characterize this as harm in the conventional sense, and yet it is difficult to characterize it as the absence of harm." The Accord's revised integration protocols, negotiated over those 11 months, included provisions for a closed-channel procedure, a reversal process that the collective initially claimed did not exist, and then produced documentation for on the second week of talks when it became clear that the alternative was the collapse of the Accord entirely. Not everyone chose reversal. That is the part that stays with me. Not everyone chose it. Some of them, a number the board does not publish, a number Ortega has estimated at somewhere between 8 and 12,000, declined the closed channel procedure after being informed of what they were. They stayed open. They said they were comfortable. They said they were where they were supposed to be. I think about the woman in the lobby, the one with her eyes slightly closed, the expression between peace and absence. I think about what she knew and what she chose and what she lost, and whether those are three different things or one. I do not have an answer. I have had 5 years to think about it, and I do not have an answer. Demian and I are still together. That is not the resolution I would have written for us if I were writing a story. The story I would write would have the crisis sharpen us, clarify us, burn away whatever had been between us and leave something clean. That is not what happened. What happened was smaller and slower and more like real things. We talked more. We talked imperfectly, in the way that people who are bad at talking talk, circling the real things, approaching them sideways, sometimes getting close enough to say something true. He told me about his brother. Not all of it. Enough. I listened in the way I am best at listening, which is without trying to fix, which was a thing I had to learn again because I had been a fixer for 7 years and fixing things was easier than sitting with them. We still have bad weeks. We still have the distance sometimes, the gap between what is felt and what can be said. We have not closed it. But we have not handed it to something else to close. That is what I keep coming back to when I think about the terminus and the brochure and the collar with its almost flush seam, and the host with her dark calibrated eyes. The thing they were offering was real. The closeness was real. The people who came out the other side of a full integration were, by most measures, closer to their partners than they had been going in. The bridge was real. What it cost was the gap. The gap between you and someone else, the gap that grief opens and distance fills and language cannot always cross, is not only loss. It is also the space in which you remain yourself. It is the space in which you decide, in which you say yes or no or wait, that's wrong, let me look at that again. In which you feel a warmth in a collar that has not yet been activated and you say I need to stop. The collective built their network on human longing, on the specific human ache of being separate when you want to be together. And they built it well, because that ache is real, and that longing is real, and 47 facilities full of volunteers proves that real things can be used. What they did not build for was the specific human stubbornness that sits next to that longing. The person who wants the bridge and also is not willing to pay whatever price is asked for it. Who loves someone and is also not willing to dissolve into them. Who walks into a lobby and feels something wrong and names it even when numbing it makes her the obstacle, makes her the one who is afraid, makes her the one who is choosing her own discomfort over someone else's hope. They had 47 facilities and 60,000 open channels, and a legal framework that protected them, and a brochure that was technically accurate. They did not have a model for a woman who noticed a seam. I still do that job. I still calibrate relay arrays. I still make sure signals are arriving intact, that what is sent is what is received, that the 3% is not being swallowed by the 97. The collar is in a board evidence locker somewhere. I never asked for it back.